When looking at game review magazines back in the day, which one did you go for? Commodore User, Amstrad Computer User, Sinclair User, Amstrad Action, ZZap 64, Crash, Your Sinclair? Or maybe none of these, as there was a 1,000,001 8-bit magazines that did game reviews back in the day. A little while ago I did a video that annoyed you all because I used stupid voices, yep, never again, about the 52, there's a couple of titles missing, oh, bad cough. 52 games that got the top award from the 3 big Spectrum magazines back in the day. Crash Magazine, Sinclair User and Your Sinclair. Although I often thought this cover was really shit and looked like it was done by a child until I realised it was actually done by a child. So belated sorry to Wayne Horan, 15 from Ireland. I mean, it's no Oliver Frey, but it's better than the cack I could do when I was 15, so fair dues, Wayne. Sorry, mate. Now, my favourite from these 3 did vary month for month, depending on what was on the front cover. But if I had to pick a favourite for game reviews, I would say it was probably Crash Magazine. There was nothing else quite like a Crash Smash. I mean, the other 2 had, what, mega games and classics, but nothing kind of felt quite as special as a Crash Smash. So Crash was my definite go-to magazine for ZX Spectrum reviews. Now, quite a few Commodore magazines existed also back in the day, with probably the 2 most popular ones being Commodore User and ZZap 64. Now, Commodore User was a bit of a more expanded Commodore magazine, did reviews and talked about hardware for everything Commodore, whereas ZZap 64, as the name suggests, was all about the Commodore 64. But whether you liked the zany teenage appeal of ZZap 64 over some more of the serious magazines or not, or vice versa, this was by far the most popular C64 magazine amongst my rich Commodore 64 owning mates back in the day. I think that's already 3 times I've said back in the day, so can you just slap me when I keep saying it, please? Thank you. Admittedly, though, the award in the ZZap magazine was pretty cack actually. They had this, the Sizzler. Yeah, and then occasionally, maybe once a month or maybe once or twice a year, they'd have a gold medal award. Wow, really up all night thinking that one up, weren't they? But then ZZap's competition, like Commodore User, had things called Screen Stars. So I think Sizzlers just about wins. So Commodore magazine is the pick of the bunch for me. On the Amstrad front, there was also plenty of magazines to choose from, but these 2 were probably the most popular. Newsfield, who were responsible for ZZap and Crash, did have a go at doing an Amstrad one called Amtics, but it was rather short-lived and couldn't compete with Future Publishing's Amstrad Action. So although Amstrad Computer User was a very popular magazine, it was kind of more of a hardware, a bit of software, but all-ranging software type magazine as opposed to a game reviewing magazine. Whereas Amstrad Action, although did have certain serious, probably more serious elements to it than ZZap and Crash, our other 2 picks here, was very much more a game review magazine. And I did quite like their, I don't know if you can see that there, but I did quite like their Mastergame logo with the AA from Amstrad Action in it. Quite cool. And games that weren't quite Mastergame games were AA Raves, which is a thing of its time, isn't it? Definitely my pick, Amstrad Action, for the Amstrad. So you may be wondering what the hell I'm going on about, and you would be right in doing so. I basically wanted to find out if there were any games that got an Amstrad Action Master Game, a ZZap 64 Gold Medal or Sizzler, and a Crash Smash. So by my calculations, after spending hours and hours late into the night, not spending any time with my family or friends, just for you lot, don't buy me anything, but if you're not subbed, can you hit that love button? Love button? What's the love button? Actually, the like button is a love, isn't it? Is it? I'll check now. No, it's not. What am I thinking of? Oh, Instagram, is it? Fucking penis. There are just 19 games, yes, 19 games that received a AA Mastergame, a Crash Smash, and a Sizzler or Gold Award. So to make this even more exciting,
and life just gets more exciting,
what I've done is I've taken the main score from each magazine review, found the average, so I can make a chart and find the greatest 8-bit game as reviewed by the greatest 8-bit magazines. And I bet none of you will guess what the top game is. Now, no fast forwarding. Yes, you, Tony. And you, Dave. Pete. Number 18, Space Crusade, Gremlin Interactive, 1992. A late game to the 8-bit party, which had also crossed over to the 16-bit side, Space Crusade was apparently the first game to be set in the Warhammer 40,000 universe. No hate please if I'm wrong. Based very closely on the board game with the same name, its unique isometric and top-down views on the action was praised by all, as was the strategy RPG elements of the game that made it. Not a game you can really just jump into, so worth seeking out the manual for this one. And Crash Magazine proclaimed that the game was more packed than a toffee crisp, and as good as the 16-bit versions minus the colour. High praise indeed. ZZap Magazine had seemed to have taken the loud and lewd approach by 1992 and turned it up a notch in its reviews section, bruv, giving Space Crusade 93% and equally praising the two different viewing angles and close resemblance to the board game. As seen here, it looks better than the Specky version with a better use of colour, but runs a bit slower and like the Spectrum version goes all monochrome for the 3D bits. Amstrad Action gave the game to its front cover, which looks pretty freaking cool actually, and obviously liked the game but commented on it being quite easy and no laser squad, which is a fair assessment. CPC players got a mix between the C64 and Specky version, but it's probably closer to the Spectrum cousin. Number 17, Lotus Esprit Turbo Challenge, Gremlin Graphics, 1990. Another later Gremlin game that was also a 16-bit one, but equally praised highly for all the poor sods still clinging on to their 8-bit hand-me-downs at this point. A nice 2-player split screen, so definitely a game that is improved if you have friends as you try and progress through the levels together. Here on the Commodore 64 version, the hit detection seems a little clunky, but even though it's quite dated now, it's still fun enough for a few goes. ZZap scored it the same as the Amiga version here in their review, praising its speed and 2-player fun. CPC fans didn't fare as well, with a version looking remarkably similar to the Spectrums, but with better defined cars and other non-colour clashing issues that the Spectrum had. It's so framey though and feels quite sluggish compared to the C64 version, but again was praised by Amstrad Action for being fast and realistic, so maybe you have to look at it with 1990 eyes. Amstrad Action gave it 93% but did mark it down quite a bit on the graphics because of the limited colour and small playing window, which is no different 2 players or not. The worst looking of the 3 once you start playing, as the menu is identical to the CPC one, is the Specky version, but it moves at a faster pace than the Amstrad offering for me, so is more playable today. It's still not a title I would return to, and if you have nostalgia for it, it might not give you the same hit as maybe a Chase HQ or Death Chase, but I can see why it's scored highly. Scraping into Crash Smash territory in Crash here with nearly all the sub-scores in the 80s, but as one reviewer remarks, someone from Gremlin came to the Crash offices and took everyone out for rides in his Lotus, maybe bumping the score up a little. Interestingly, it scored more than the budget re-release of my favourite Spectrum game Target Renegade on the same page, which they were clearly struggling to find a screenshot for. A screenshot? Actually, it is a shit screenshot. Number 16, Gauntlet, US Gold, 1986. Atari's Gauntlet was an exciting release on the home micros because the arcade game was such a huge hit, mainly due to its 4-player co-op style gameplay. Playing it solo, as I am here on the very colourful Amstrad version, just doesn't hit the same. It's definitely a game that plays best with friends, even if limited to just the 2 players on these home ports. CPC fans got a very nice port which shows off the system's colour palette very nicely with some neat touches like the shadow on our hero here. It scrolls absolutely fine and runs at a similar speed to the Commodore version. It seems to cope with plenty going on and is a damn good port that definitely deserves to be here. Amstrad Action agreed that the game was heaps better and easier with 2 players, but fun nonetheless. Playing the Spectrum version from a tape image, I was quite surprised how much multi-loading there was, but then again the game is pretty friggin' huge. A much simpler looking affair here with the black sparse backdrops, but man does this zip along. It's way quicker than the other versions, so even though it doesn't look as good, it plays even better. Crash Magazine heaped praise on its faithfulness to the arcade original in speed alone and loved the 2-player aspect of it too. Commodore 64 users were also not disappointed with a version that massively resembles the CPC one but with more muted colours, that scrolls and plays just fine and is worthy enough of its Sizzler award. They also agreed 1 player is nowhere near as much fun and that the game had a couple of bugs, but these 2 points were not even close to stopping this one getting over 90%. Number 15, North and South, Infogrames, 1991. Not sure where to start with this one as it's very unique in its gameplay but not what I expected at all. After figuring out whose side you are on in this battle across the not very United States of America, it all looks like a board game at first and honestly here on the Spectrum not a very nice looking one either. But if you raid an enemy's fort or attack a train, or even just go full into battle, some rather fun and excellently done arcade sequences appear where you must avoid the knife throwing enemies or try and wipe out the attacking army before they wipe you out. It's all done very well here on the Spectrum, although I ended up playing the disc version as the tape images were constantly asking for the next tape to play the next part. Feels like a multi-load nightmare, but on disc it was a pretty perfect Spectrum game late on in its life. Crash gave it 96%, claiming that all this talk of the Spectrum dying would be rubbished if more games came out like this one. High praise indeed. The Commodore version is a lot nicer to look at and graphically pushes everything it can out of the Commodore 64, which made emulation a bit of a pain. Lots of comparisons to the Amiga version in the ZZap 64 review, who reviewed and loved the disc version but warned what might be in store for any tape buyers. The CPC version is pretty much the Spectrum one with a nicer colour palette. It plays just as great and again makes perfect sense on disc rather than cassette. Amstrad Action said pretty much what the other 2 did, giving the game 91% and remarking how much fun the game is in 2 players. A cracking little game with a nice mix of genres. Number 14. Way of the Exploding Fist, Melbourne House, 1985. We're going old school at number 14, which I like because I always thought they scored much higher towards the end of the 8-bits era to try and keep things going, but maybe not. Not much to say about this one except all 3 versions are flipping lovely and I didn't read any control methods when loading them up, which made the Spectrum and CPC ones seen here pretty difficult to master, so you can watch the CPC slug it out with itself. Not much separates the 3 versions, with the CPC and C64 looking very similar, with the Specky one doing a nice job of avoiding any colour clash issues. Lots of moves and tactics come into play here, and this is a game I fondly remember being obsessed with when I went round my mate's house who had a Commodore 64. It just looks so flipping cool in C64 colours and gives me a big nostalgia hit. As for the magazines, Amstrad Action showed off all the 19 move combos, giving it a 94% in their first ever issue, 93% in ZZap with another guide to all the moves, and all involved praising its realistic karate style. 92% in Crash's verdict, with them marking it down on how long it takes to get into, but loving it all the same. Number 13, Bounder, Gremlin Graphics, 1986. Well, lordy lord, where do we start with this one? Probably with this here Commodore version, because quite frankly it's those ZZap boys that bumped the score up somewhat with their review that we'll come to in a moment. Firstly, the positives. It looks amazing on the C64. The way the ball bounces and also gives you that sense of height when it falls is all very well done. The bouncing area is very well detailed and easy on the eye. The controls are fine and I like the originality of it all. However, and I may have mentioned this in the past, but I'm certainly no god gamer, and this thing is tough. I mean really tough, and not just honest tough, if you know what I mean. I mean, sometimes you respawn in such a way that instant death is inevitable, skill issue or not, and that sucks. The game is hard enough without incessant alien things coming at you and making the whole experience even more troublesome. As for the CPC, the same cons exist, with admittedly the same pros too. I mean, it looks great, controls great, yada yada yada. But here the level of difficulty is even worse. I mean, I didn't play for long, but just finishing this first level was super hard. It really is a memory game at times, as certain paths lead to certain death. The Spectrum version struggles with making everything clear with the colour limitations, but does an okay job. What is better here though is that the game is somewhat easier. Not much, but I managed to finish and progress a little on level 2 within 10 minutes of playtime. So the magazines then? What did they love so much? Well, let's start with those Zap boys, shall we? I think they just loved the originality of it and the awesome graphics, suggesting that the frustratingly tough elements of the game made it even more addictive, which is why they gave it 98% for hookability and 97% overall. Value for money score is also 98%, which I guess is okay, although still a bit high, but you do get another average game included with it called Metabolis, which would actually drive you just as nuts, to be fair. Crash Magazine actually picked up on the fact that it's the most playable version and stuck to their guns on everything else. Amstrad Action contradicted themselves with the pros and cons, with a pro being it's difficult even from the start, and a con being it's difficult from the start. Okay, thanks boys. Number 12.
Full moon.
Full moon.
Half moon.
Half moon.
Total eclipse.
Incentive software. So much to answer for a few decades after your ambitious attempts at bringing 3D to the 8-bits via your Freescape engine. Now, this is possibly the most playable one I've come across in your quest to solve puzzles within a pyramid in the Egyptian heat. I think it's fair to start with the Spectrum here as the most underpowered micro to perform 3D, but it's certainly not the worst at doing so. I mean, yes, the monochrome rooms make it look difficult to work out what the flip is going on, but it moves at a semi-reasonable pace, enough so to make this semi-playable in 2024, which is the point, I guess. 3D games like this were the thing of dreams to us way back then, so for incentive to try and pull it off was a hell of an achievement. I don't ever recall these games being talked about as the next big thing though, and I guess the main reason for that was because the 8-bit micros were simply not up to the job. The CPC version does at least tick as many boxes as possible. It plays pretty much the same as the Spectrum one, but has all the colour too, which when compared makes the game a million times better. Instantly, I had more of an understanding about what was going on in the different rooms. The Commodore 64 version is the same with better colours, but my god, it is shit slow. Like 0.2 frames per second slow. It's terrible, and it's a shame reviewers didn't look at the other versions to compare it to and ask why the Commodore version couldn't do what the others, most notably the CPC one, were doing. Especially as in Zap, the reviewers even remarked that they weren't fans of these games because they were slow, but enjoyed this one because of the puzzles. Yeah, okay. Crash also lapped up the 3D marvel of it all and also thought this was the best Freescape game to date. And who am I to argue? Amstrad Action go all in with interviews with incentive, a lengthy review and even a demo on the adjoining cassette. Equally agreeing this is the best of the bunch so far, and it was certainly the best of the bunch on the CPC, that's for sure. Number 11. The Untouchables and Wizball. Ocean Software, 1989 and 1987. Can you flipping believe it? Two games scored exactly the same on average and then exactly the same on average on the subscores. I had to check it 10 times. How bizarre. Anyways, the first game is the stupidly difficult Untouchables. Kudos to anyone who actually got past level 1 back in the day, because this was cheat poke central for me. What a tough game, which pisses me off a bit as I wonder what the reviewers were actually reviewing. No mention of how hard it is in Crash Magazine, just praise for all the 6 levels and how diverse they all are. Okay Crash, thanks for that. The C64 version fares no better. I mean, level 1 looks a lot better with a more colourful, defined spectacle, but it's still nuts to play. I kept killing the bad guy, but Lord knows where the evidence went. Zap seemed to be in the same trap as Crash though. Look at all these wonderfully graphically brilliant levels you will never play. Classic. At least on the CPC version I had, there was a level skip built in on the crack, which was neat, so at least I managed to play some of the other levels, which honestly weren't up to that much, although the accountant's blue brains up the wall was a highlight. I did enjoy one reviewer suggesting that although it's very blue, you will get into it. Okay, how much are Ocean paying you at this point? The trend kinda carries on to the tied game here, Wizball. Yeah, I know it's a bloody classic, but hear me out on this one. The Commodore 64 version is fantastic, and it's probably my favourite Commodore 64 game actually, and rightly deserving of its 96% score. They rightly mentioned the presentation and the sound as being particularly good, and it really is. It can certainly be one of those games that you might think you can just pick up and play quickly, but it's unusually easier as you progress, so initially it's pretty brutal at times. I guess the premise can become a little tedious and repetitive, but it's such an unusual game that its uniqueness will hopefully keep you interested. Now, my problem. The other 2 versions. Are they worthy of a Top Game award? I'm not really sure. The Spectrum port does look fantastic too, and sounds good on the 128K, but it's just that bit too sensitive to play, making it really hard initially to control your Wizball properly. If it was just a bit slower, it would have been a perfect port. Crash Magazine do admit it can be tricky at first, but wash over how tricky it actually is. As for the CPC version, I mean, it starts off quite the opposite actually. It's the easier of the 3, and the items always seem to appear in the same places too. But, and it's a big but, it's a flick screen, and a bad one at that. Sometimes you insta-die as soon as you enter the screen, which is so frustrating as you have to collect all the bits again to make the game playable. Certainly not Master Game worthy in my eye. Top 10 time now, and we start off with Cybernoid, Houston Consultants, 1988. Crash Magazine called this the ultimate Spectrum arcade game, and it's difficult to argue with them. Even by 1988 standards, this is glorious to look at. A real marvel of what can be squeezed out of these 8-bit micros when 16-bit games were very much pressing home the differences. With a similar look and feel to the rather excellent Exelon, this turned it up a notch in a fast-paced spacecraft shooter that also required a bit of brain matter to progress, that was pretty brutal honestly, and no different playing today, having not done so for many years. On the C64, the gameplay is pretty much the same, but doesn't wow so much here. I think it's because the graphics are good, but not anything breathtaking for the Commodore 64's capabilities, whereas the Spectrum version really felt like it took the Spectrum game into another level graphically. It seems that it plays the same as the Speccy version, it's pretty tough, also which the Zap team did remark on, but it's a kind of frenetic, frustratingly addictive type way, etc, etc. Similar story on the CPC review, with the outstanding graphics really overriding any issues with the game. It does look particularly stunning here on the CPC though, and I would say is a smidgen easier than the other 2, but just a smidgen. For me though, this is a fantastic mind-blowing Spectrum game, worthy of a Master Game on the Amstrad, and certainly worthy of a decent score on the Commodore 64. Sizzler? Not sure. I'll leave that up to you. Number 9. Elite. Firebird Software, 1985. To be honest, I thought this would and probably should be high in this list. Never has a game taken me into space exploration as much as this one did. I mean, I was there, I was flying that ship. All 3 versions are hugely playable, with useful keyboard overlays for all the different ship and docking controls. The CPC version looks great and maybe is a little bit more framey than the others, but still plays well. Amstrad Action remarked how space trading games were not something new, but Elite really ups the ante in that genre. Crash Magazine were probably even more blown away at how such a vast game with so much depth can be played on the humble 48K Specky, and they are right with thinking that. At no point do you struggle to work out what is going on, and it's as decent as any other port. Commodore players often moaned at the flickering appearance of objects on screen, but I didn't find it that bad on the very quick playthrough I had just mucking about outside docking. This was the first ZZap Gold Medal award-winning game, which is pretty cool quite honestly, with them, like the other two, marvelling at the experience and vastness of the game. Even a nice little piece on the authors of the game, Ian Bell and David Brabham, and how they both did financially very well out of the game when Firebird snapped up the rights. Number 8. Turrican, Rainbow Arts, 1990. Back to the 90s for, spoiler alert, the first of 2 Turrican games. This game to me is a very good example of what was capable on each of these systems by the time they were coming to the end of their commercial life. Each game is fast, with crazily good scrolling, with plenty of weapons and nasties to defeat. Now I never played this when it came out, so ignore my ignorant gameplay, but this is a blast everywhere you play it. The Specky port does about as well as it could do and has a good use of colour without becoming a mess. The CPC port really shows off the CPC's colour palette and runs nicely and quickly too. The weapons available and the different key combos to use them take a bit of getting used to, but I really like all the different pickups and carnage that ensues. The Commodore version looks unreal too. It's incredibly good to look at and play, and is probably my favourite of the 3. Magazines? Well, Crash went on about how well hard Turrican was with all his weapons and shit, and ZZap were impressed with everything it seemed, but noticeably the size of it. Oh, and the waterfalls. Amstrad Action went for the worst colour choices known to man in their review, before equally declaring that size does indeed matter. A classic for sure. Number 7. Myth, History in the Making. System 3 software, 1989. If you're wondering if the ZZap reviewing team here have finally lost the plot, well, that's them dressed up for Christmas apparently in the 1989 special edition, where this Sizzler got a very respectable 94%. Now, I had played this game a little bit on the Specky, not back in the day as this one passed me by, but in recent years when the game came to my attention. In a similar graphical vein as games like Cybernoid or Exelon, this is absolutely fantastic on the Specky. I've never had a serious sit down with this one, but I feel like I really should. I don't like the controls and the movement very much, which has possibly put me off. I find the context switching a little clunky, and the fact our little dude is quite sensitive to movement that can make jumps a little tricky. This feels like me problems though that would be improved as I got into the game perhaps. The Spectrum and CPC ports are pretty much the same, with slightly better or cleaned up use of the colour on the CPC, which apparently is missing a couple of screens that exist on the Spectrum version. What blows my tiny mind though is the Commodore version. It's almost a completely different game. I was getting annoyed as for the life of me I could not get this working in any emulators, so had to revert to watching someone else play it, but blimey how contrasting this is and how incredible does it look. Quite frankly, the game is a stunning achievement for different reasons wherever you played it, which is why it's worthy of its position here. Crash Magazine did remark how difficult it is to get into. I feel slightly redeemed, but admitted it was bloody good once you did. Amstrad Action admitted it was just a Spectrum port, but let it go on this occasion as it was such a bloody good one. Fair enough. I just need to sit down and play the blooming thing now. Number 6. Lemmings, Psygnosis, 1991. Publishers Europress decided to relaunch ZZap 64 magazine in line with their other Forces, Yes Forces range of magazines, Sega Force, N-Force, Amiga Force, SNES Force, with, drumroll, Commodore Force. What also has Force? Well, wind apparently, with the scores given a gale warning. Flippin' heck. So what is a Sizzler replaced with? A hurricane hit. Genius. So technically Lemmings just about deserves to be here, as Commodore Force was essentially ZZap 64 rebadged, so shut it. Anyway, on the Commodore 64 it's all pretty nice for the game that was literally ported to everything. Here's a quick list if you don't believe me. Here the window is small and disk loading is frequent, but it's all here. Nicely defined Lemmings doing Lemmings things. It does slow down a lot when a lot of Lemmings appear, which is quite noticeable, but I was more than happy with it. The Specky version is also admirable, I guess, and I see why Crash liked it, and although very all one colour with the Lemmings resembling little more than just blobs, it still does enough to make you feel like you are playing Lemmings. So happy days, I guess. Best of the bunch was probably the CPC version, whose colour scheme worked well here. Slower in general, but no slowdown if that makes sense when a lot is going on. A great soundtrack across all three is also noteworthy, and the game is definitely worthy of its top 10 spot. Top 5 time now, and we start with Smash TV, Ocean Software, 1991. And the award for the worst menu design goes to... But that didn't stop this being a Crash Smash TV. You see what I did there? Despite there only being one player. I mean, 2-player Smash TV was the only way I ever played it on my 16-bit machine of choice. So it kind of weirds me out that this is just one player. But that one player does play terrifically well on the Specky. It moves pretty rapidly and deals with colour clash issues extremely well. I mean, just look at our red-faced friend happily shooting... Although obviously very late to the party, it's pretty impressive with what's being squeezed out of the Specky by this point. Crash Magazine went a little too far with this gem. If you have any Amiga owning buddies who think the Spectrum belongs in a museum, along with the counting frame and Betamax video recorder, sit them in front of your machine and load up your copy of Ocean Smash TV. It'll have them crying into their £30 a throw software collection, wishing they hadn't wasted their money on upgrading. Yeah, okay. Keep living that dream, mate. CPC time, and despite still not knowing what is going on with her mid-rift, this is another great advert for what the CPC could have achieved. I mean, it really can't be said enough that this micro really was underrated when you see how good games like this one look. I mean, just look at it. Amstrad Action took the whole smashing TV things quite literally with their cover and a brief snippet of famous TV smashes, none of which were really that famous, although a nice mention of people smashing their TVs when Jeremy Beadle is on, just for being Jeremy Beadle. Jeremy makes an appearance in ZZap, who also take things up a notch with their list of TV game show hosts you'd like to smash. No, not like that. I mean, there's no punches pulled here, ladies and gentlemen. Les Dennis, we asked 100 people which game show host they would like to most drop from a very great height. Cilla Black, wouldn't you just have to send her on a blind date with a hand grenade? Matthew Kelly, would you like to break his other leg? You bet. Bob Monkhouse, king of the false smile, should be made to sell the satanic verses door to door in Iran. Roy Walker, what have we got here? It's a headstone. It's got my name on it, and the catchphrase is wishful thinking. Jesus Christ. Oh, and look at number 1, Jeremy Beadle. Well, what can I say? For crimes too numerous to mention, should be built into the Channel Tunnel. Let's see if he's game for a laugh then. So how about the game then? Much like the others, it's a banger. Moves and plays as well as any other version, I reckon, and is worthy of its score. Although I'm still getting over giving a hand grenade to Cilla Black.
Surprise, surprise. Surprise, surprise.
Number 4, Turrican 2, Rainbow Arts, 1991. You wait for ages for one Turrican to come along and then 2 turn up. Yes, the seemingly anything you can do, Turrican 2 can do better. That was rubbish. Can do better. Yeah, I don't know. I've only ever played both for review purposes. Yes, shocking, I know. So I'm not the best person to ask. But researching it, and I think the general consensus is, yes, this is the better one. It's a little tougher, but better. Like the first one, the Commodore version is the better port, but they are all pretty decent on each system. The Specky one plays great, can't say I was blown away with it compared to the first one, but it's pretty decent with no problems with lots going on at once. CPC fans got a decent proper Amstrad version too, and it's also worthy of its Mastergame Award scoring of 95%, with AA proclaiming it could possibly be the best Amstrad shooter ever just because it's so freaking huge. Crash pretty much said exactly the same thing with exactly the same score, so who am I to argue? ZZap went one further with a gold medal award proclaiming it's the sort of game you would expect to only play on one of those Japanese console thingies. High praise indeed. Number 3. Spindizzy, Electric Dream Software, 1986. Now, call me a shit gamer, but I don't like these types of games. I mean, 720 was about as close to liking this sort of Marble Madness type movement that I got to, and this is not 720. Positives for it are here on the specky that it's a nice looking isometric affair that is really quick between screens and does give you a real sense of trying to maneuver the spinning top thing. Same applies in the more polished Amstrad version. It looks beautiful here actually. Everything is so well defined and it's almost too good for the CPC. The same can be said for the C64 version too. It looks so good that I want to like it, but it's so damn fiddly. Look at me in this room. I mean, just look at me. 12-year-old me wouldn't have stood for this, let alone 38 years later. ZZap got properly carried away with it, and reading the 98% mark review, even I got excited and want to play it even though I just had. Amstrad Action really pressed home the fact that this was an Amstrad game exclusively until the other ports, and really showed that the Amstrad was no pushover, which it wasn't. I guess that's the thing here. This game released in 1986 and looked this good. I can see why they got excited. Crash Magazine gave the inferior specky version a solid 93%, which is still a decent score, proclaiming this certainly showed off what the state of the art was on the Spectrum in 1986. I can't argue with any of that until you play the blimmin' thing. Still, worthy I think to be here, just maybe not quite as high. Number 2. Driller, Incentive Software, 1987. Yeah, style over substance rears its ugly head again at number 2 with the second Freescape game on the list. All three magazines declared that Total Eclipse was the best of the bunch, only to reward Driller with higher marks, but there we go. Listen, this is slow. It was slow then and it's even slower now. But we could put up with it back then just because we wanted 3D worlds to explore. Could we? Now, I'm not sure you should always get what you ask for, certainly on hardware that wasn't quite up to the job, but here we are. All three versions are good at what they do though, with similar experiences all round, just with different colour palettes. The CPC version here is nice to look at and is really as good as 3D gets for the time, with the vehicle moving at a moderate speed as you explore the terrain. I can see why AA liked it when they gave it Mastergame status in January 1988, and Crash gave it 97% and simply remarked there was nothing else like it, which is not wrong to be fair. ZZap had equal praise but also admired the brilliant soundtrack, which is honestly good. Interestingly, at the same time all these magazines were making this game number 2 in our chart, Commodore User magazine gave it a rather harsh 5 out of 10, although it's hard to disagree with their comments about how sluggish and jerky it is, which takes away from the 3D marvel and really ruins the game. For me, it's somewhere in the middle, so I reckon 7 out of 10 would have been fair. Perhaps. And so we come to our number 1 game, and it's Ocean Software's isometric masterpiece, Head Over Heels, from 1987. John Rittman was so impressed with Ultimate's 1984 isometric title Night Law that he decided he would like to do one himself. And in 1986, Ocean Software published his offering, simply named after the lead character, Batman. John employed the services of Bernie Drummond to take care of the graphical elements he wanted for the game, as Bernie's style suited John's needs. The game looked beautiful and played really well, so John and Bernie had a certain hit on their hands. After its successes, it would have been wasteful not to use the same engine once again and also learn from mistakes made and make an even better sequel of sorts. John took the original engine and added the ability to have 2 characters to control at different and same locations within the game. With sprite limitations, the oversized headed characters that Bernie created solved any collision box detection issues and also gave Bernie more room to bring the characters' faces to life. With a working title of Foot and Mouth, possibly not ideal for production, Bernie, as the creative one, came up with a few names including Rough and Tumble before Head Over Heels was agreed on. Even though the game was bigger with more puzzles and with the unique 2-character element to it, there must have been some trepidation as to whether another isometric title was what everyone needed when the review copies were sent out. Although the amount of isometric titles is mentioned in the Crash magazine review, the qualities of this one far outshone whether the market was already saturated with this type of game. With all the critics in the reviews pretty much saying the same thing, only one of them is probably valid in criticising the 128K version, as was the same as many other titles before it and after it, in only having an improved soundtrack outside 48K. The story is a typically bonkers fantasy setting where our spy heroes must escape the castle they are imprisoned in and retrieve crowns in the hope they push the populace to overthrow the evil empire. I'm sure, like me, you either had no clue or didn't really care about the plot here and just wanted to meander around and try and work out the puzzles. I'll be clear at this point, I was one of the not another isometric game crowd. I was always drawn to them because they did look wonderful, but I was always quickly tired of the annoying movement, obscured viewing and tricky puzzles. The same kind of applies now, but I mean, just look how gorgeous this still is despite even getting a Next computer reboot a little while ago. The original Spectrum game still holds up graphically. It's not really for me, which annoys the hell out of me because I feel like I should really like it. I think Crash overscored a little, bearing in mind they went for the top sub-score as their final one, and maybe around 94% would have been more accurate. In a rather scathing article some 2 years later in Crash magazine by Will Brooker, he takes a look at the 3D isometric games to see if they still stand up in the more mature Spectrum years. In short, he doesn't think so. Ant Attack doesn't even make 30%, and he goes on to say Head Over Heels is probably the best isometric title before scoring it less than he re-reviewed Batman. Go figure. So I think we can agree that often these game reviews can be taken with a pinch of salt when looking at them some nearly 40 years later. The Commodore version is surprisingly and disappointingly similar to the Spectrum version and feels like a direct port of that, which feels like a bit lazy, honestly. It's also a little bit more framey maybe. It's still a great game though, with everything intact. I just feel it could have been made even more special, particularly with the addition of Peter Clark's excellent soundtrack. The piano sonato in C is glorious. No such mention of any of these shortcomings by the ZZap team, who gave the game a whopping 98% and made it their first gold medal award winner of the year, which is saying something in the August edition. It seems it still looks good enough here for the C64 crowd, and the amount of puzzles and rooms to explore far outweigh anything else. I mean, 98% would suggest pure perfection. In fairness, their rating didn't drop at all by the time the Hit Squad label was released in June 1990, or at least they allude to the fact Commodore owners might be wary of such a Spectrum looking game, but the fact it plays so unbelievably well makes up for it in more ways than one. Saving the best to last, well, for me anyways, we have the CPC version, which Amstrad Action actually scored lower than ZZap and Crash. Here though, the splash of lovely vibrant CPC-esque colours make all the difference. It's truly beautiful, and any personal misgivings I had about this genre go out the window as I just marvel at how good this looks here. It plays just as well as the other two as well, and is very much my go-to version if I stupidly think, oh, I'll just have one more go just to see. Reviewed around the same time as the Spectrum one, I'm surprised Amstrad Action didn't go all in on the colour differences, but instead just generally lauded the game as the other two did. So, worthy of the best 8-bit game on these micros? Look, if it was Spindizzy or Driller, I would say absolutely not. But I think looking back at these games, knowing what we do now, what did well and what didn't, and all the nostalgia that comes with it, I think Head Over Heels is a pretty good choice actually. I mean, even I know that the Next computer, which I don't follow any news for, recently got a really nice reboot remake of Head Over Heels, which they wouldn't bother doing, right, if nobody had nostalgia or love for this game. Anyways, let me know your thoughts in the comments on whether you think this is a worthy winner of the best 8-bit game for the 3 best 8-bit micros as reviewed by the 3 best 8-bit game review magazines. God, that took a while to rehearse. I'm going to finish reading Commodore Force and learn all about wind. And as always, I'll see you on the next one. Bye for now.